Hi everyone, this is Dr. Giobbi, and this week we're taking a look at one of the subsections of critical media theory, and that is Marxist analysis of the media. So, boy, Karl Marx has been a very controversial figure over the past 200 years. Nearly 200 years. What I think that we need to take into consideration about Marx, the way we're going to approach Marx, is firstly, Marx is probably one of the most important psychologists of the 19th and 20th centuries. His psychology, in other words, what makes a person who they are, is firmly outlined in his earliest writings, the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844. So, if we approach Marx as a psychologist, and we kind of bracket out or remove ourselves from our possible attitudes towards Marx and Marxism that we may have grown up with. Over the years, I've encountered, majority of us have grown up in a capitalist culture. I have encountered students over the years who grew up in communist cultures, communist countries. I have encountered students who grew up in socialist countries. I myself have visited communist countries, including China. And I have also lived in and visited many socialist countries. And I was born and spent my formative years in a capitalist, perhaps Darwinian capitalist culture, the United States, and visited many other different capitalist countries, nations, with different forms of capitalism, different forms of socialism. The only form of communism that I encountered was in China. So, that being said, I guess a good place to start is to consider your own bias as we approach this topic. So I'm going to ask you to bracket out whatever bias you have about the ideas of Marx, Karl Marx, and just suspend those attitudes for a moment, whether they are pro-Marxist ideology or anti-Marxist ideology. Bracket those out, and let's just look at ideas from a dispassionate standpoint. In one of the most important qualities that I acquired through my studies over the years, from really spectacular. I've been fortunate to study with some of the most brilliant minds of 20th and 21st centuries. And something that I learned from these people is that one can read ideas without embracing ideas. In other words, one can study Marx, and one can utilize the tools, the critical Marxist critique of capitalism, without being a Marxist. And I think this is an important thing to keep in mind. You will encounter professors and writers and teachers and people you study, and their ideas may be more or less ideological in nature, more dogmatic than presenting dogma, belief, more investment in that belief. I like to say this is the difference between someone who studies for a master's degree in economics versus someone who studies for an MBA, Master's in Business Administration. So a master's degree in economics, you study the theory of economics. Master's degree in business administration, you study the same material, only it's using it to make profit. Another example that might help you to understand our approach to this, you can study theology. So you can get most theology departments are part of or with philosophy departments. So you can get a doctorate in theology or a master's degree in theology. Or you can get a doctorate or a master's degree in pastoring, in applied theology. One is an academic intellectual exercise in exploring the ideas of theology. The other is a promotion of a certain ideology. You're actually learning to go out and learn the tricks of the trade for turning people on to that belief system, that religion. So I hope I'm parsing this out for you. We're going to approach Marxist theory of Marxist critique of capitalism without necessarily being Marxists. I'm not a Marxist. I would not want to give up my retirement investments or my stock market investments that are going to hopefully feed me for the rest of my life. The money that I invest for the past, since I was in my 20s, the money that I've invested, and retirement investments that are done through the university system. All of these things, I would not sacrifice those for the world, because one day those are going to feed me within the system I live in. And I think that's important to keep in mind, because you will have professors who are hardcore Marxists, hardcore communists, and will enjoy the benefits of the system that they've. Without the stock market, there is no retirement fund. The retirement fund and investing in compound interest is one of the most intelligent ways of becoming independent, becoming economically free, as long as you control your desire. If you have to control your desire, or you stay exactly where you are. If you get a raise and you keep spending at student level and you get a raise, well, then there's profit in there. If you get a raise and you say, oh boy, now I can increase my spending, well, then you're just as meeting needs poor as you were before. This is actually a Marxist critique of capitalism, because in our capitalist culture, we have certain ideologies, certain things that we are told to believe in. The more you make, the happier you get. More. Success, power, control. The more money you have, the happier you are. Well, Marx turns us on to the idea that later has been solidly demonstrated in economics and in psychology, that actually people's contentment goes up to a certain point of income, and then once that income continues to grow, the contentment actually goes down and decreases. So what we have to question ideology, the idea that there's a positive correlation between happiness and income. And in Marxist theory, we see this inverted U curve, that actually once you get to a certain income, as the income increases, enjoyment of life decreases. So, of course, there are different factors that are involved in this. For the last study that this was done, that income level, parsing out or controlling for things like cost of living and one's where one's living. So in other words, if you're living in Los Angeles, or if you're living in Manhattan, or if you're living in the Hamptons, there's going to be a different cost of living. That's going to affect that number. If you have multiple children, no children, that's going to affect that number. But for a single person in a, not one of these high cost areas, they find that the maximum income that you make, where you have maximum contentedness in life, is around $70,000 or $75,000 a year. And after that income, it seems like enjoyment and contentedness in life seems to decrease. So this is an experimental economics illustration of the ideology, the ideas of Marxism. We just critiqued the Marxist critique of ideology, capitalist ideology. That ideology is that the more you make, the happier you get. So in his 1844 philosophical and economic manuscripts, that is what I'm going to focus on, and largely what's focused on in our critical media studies chapter. But after you read your critical media studies chapter, and if this stuff really interests you and turns you on, my goodness, you'll find quite a bit on the internet about this. YouTube, view with discretion. I've posted up some reliable and thoughtful and intelligent videos on Marxist critique. Of course, when you click on the YouTube, you don't know who you're getting, what you're getting, so proceed with caution. If you're going to look into those things, please don't use them in your assignments, only use what I give you, but use good critical thinking. If you want to read further in this, I recommend Erich Fromm's Marxist Concept of Man. The first half is Fromm's introduction as Marxist psychologist, as I'm presenting him. The second half are the Marx philosophical and economic manuscripts of 1844. These are the earliest writings of Marx. And we're going to get to a lot of these ideas in the critical media studies chapter. So if you really want to have a responsible and intelligent, this is a reliable resource, Erich Fromm. If you remember from our reading, you might notice that name, Erich Fromm. We're going to be reading one of his books later in this course. So let us now turn to Marxist analysis. Marxist analysis, our first look into, this is chapter 2 of the Otten Mack text. So I'm going to go through this and illustrate some ideas. So if we think of the value, so as I've described earlier, I am an investor. I invest in the stock market. And what I can tell you about that investment in the stock market is that I benefited greatly in studying Marxist theory. My study of Marxist theory, modes of production, profit, motive, all of these ideas greatly enhanced my ability to think about investing. I would even say that if you're involved, if you're like as a professor, we have a retirement fund. So every time I teach, there's a certain amount of money that the university contributes to a retirement fund, and I also contribute to that retirement fund. This money doesn't just go into a savings account. That would be useless, because the savings account, the money just sits there and inflation goes up and the money loses value. And instead, this is invested in a portfolio, a diverse portfolio, and you can choose whether you want it to be a conservative portfolio or a high risk but potential for high return portfolio. And usually, the younger you are, you go with higher risk, and The older you get, the closer you get to retirement, you get more conservative because you don't want to build up money and then lose it at the end. In an interesting way, these retirement funds, as you know, there's government regulations on these things. These retirement funds are a bit Marxist. And this might sound interesting. This is like we actually have a bit of a hybrid in our culture. The government doesn't pay out our pensions. In other countries, the UK is one of these, you get a government pension. But we have we only get a government pension if we have a government job. Otherwise, we have private banks that fund retirement funds, retirement programs. But these are controlled by the federal government. There are certain rules that are set by the federal government, how employers must act, how certain taxation rules, and when you can take the money out, how much you can invest in it. So these are all government controlled, which is a socialist idea, a Marxist idea. The idea that there are certain limitations and certain guidelines that keep things from being abused. It keeps usually regulations are put forth to curtail abuse of a certain system, or an idea of everyone has to participate in it for it to work. How about this? When I was growing up, when I wanted to get the new Duran Duran album, I remember when the Reflex came out and we were all excited, A View to a Kill, and the Reflex, that album in the mid-'80s, and we ran out and got the cassette tape, or the 45 even. LPs were still big at the time, but I remember myself getting the cassette tape and being very excited to buy this music, to purchase this music and own it and put it on my boombox, and thought I was great listening to this Duran Duran. Today we have a more Marxist, a more socialist approach. You can still go, you have the choice to buy the individual album. You could even buy a cassette, I would imagine. Maybe. You could buy a CD, definitely. Or you could buy the download. You pay whatever they're charging for the download and you get it on your computer. But that's like a capitalist model. You buy the product. And that's the traditional American capitalist model. But we have a more socialist model that was introduced today in recent times that you were all aware of, which is Spotify, Pandora, Apple, iTunes. And that is where you have a subscription that you pay. You pay a set amount every month and you have access to all music. You don't actually own any of these recordings, but you have access. You're paying for access to anything. So instead of buying and owning and having on your shelf a physical copy or a digital copy of that song that you possess, instead you are paying for access to a service that gives you listening rights to any song, and then anytime that song is played, that artist gets a tiny fraction of what's being of your listening. That a tiny fraction of that monthly payment you're paying, or that annual payment you're paying for access to that. And this is a very different model. And in some ways, it's very much like a socialist model, because you and I and all of us are paying a fixed amount in order to have access to all of the music rather than private property ownership. I hope I hope you're getting the gist of this, and I hope you're also seeing now suddenly the relevance of Marxist theory and, as you'll see, Marxist critique of reason, of economics. Let's turn to some, now that I've given you a kind of a broad feel, let's get turned on to some of the some of the concepts. So this is very interesting. This is around the same time, actually a little before Freud's thinking. Marx is coming up with the idea that a capitalist economy functions on two levels. And this is how Freudianism will eventually combine with Marxist theory to have Frankfurt School critical theory. So in Freud's theory, we had the conscious and the unconscious. The conscious is what you and I know about each other, the conscious egos, what we know about ourselves and what we know about others. This unconscious is beneath the surface. It's the things that are hidden from ourselves, the things that are hidden from others. So it's things that have great influence on the ostensible above the water behavior, appearance of you and me and who we are, but actually what's really driving that, what the real meaning of who we are at an unconscious level. Well, this is part of Hegelian, part of Marxist critical theory. Marx said that in any economic system, discussing capitalism in particular, there is what's called the superstructure and there's the base structure. And what he meant by this, just like Freud talked about the conscious and the unconscious, the superstructure is the artifacts of culture that we see, the functions, who people are, how they become, attitudes, beliefs, religions, fascinations, spectacle, all these things, family structure, your book says religion, politics, government, law, education, that's the superstructure. But underneath, that's what we know of our culture and our belief system, our ideology. But underneath that is an economic base structure. Let me give it to you in certain Nietzschean terms. If you grow up in a poor family, you may be taught that greed is bad, that opulence and showing off and demonstrating how much money you have is in poor taste and maybe even a sin. And all of these attitudes are a reflection of an underlying economic base structure that you grew up in, poverty. You may believe, if you grow up in the 1%, with the 1% very opulent life, you might believe that people who are poor because they don't work hard enough. This is the Protestant ethic. People that your family and you yourself have success mostly and maybe exclusively because of your hard work and dedication and special approach to life, and that you have what you have not because you were born into it, but because you come from a certain way of approaching the world. These are, as Nietzsche told us, this is how the genealogy of morals exists. Nietzsche taught us that when we grow up in a poor economic, a working class or poor proletariat, as Marx would say, a proletariat economic class, then we come to view anything that is controlling that, anything that is not that proletariat, the other, as bad, morally bad. And if we grow up in a country club, super wealthy, opulent lifestyle, we view that anything other than that is bad, is morally incorrect. And this is understanding how the base structure can manifest in the superstructure, in culture, in beliefs. We just, in this short time, we've discussed things like the Protestant ethic, Max Weber. The Protestant ethic, the idea that if you work hard, God smiles on you and rewards you. Therefore, if you're not doing so well and you don't have health insurance and things of this nature, then you must not be working hard enough and God isn't God isn't helping, isn't smiling. He's giving you a hard time until you start working hard enough. And this is an ideology. This is underlying even in a Darwinian capitalist mode of production. So here's this term, forces of production. The forces of production are, as you see in the economic base, these are the natural resources, lands, factories, technologies, labor, power, all these things. This is one of the economic base structures. The other is relation of production and labor practices and ownership, property, company, shares, modes of distribution. All of these affect our social belief systems. You may have heard in the news of critical race theory. Well, part of critical race theory is examining the economic underpinnings of slavery in the building of the United States and other cultures, and how free labor, non-waged labor contributed to incredible production of wealth, and then all the belief systems that came along with that atrocity. When we look at a Marxist analysis, we're going to look at the superstructure, what we see in everyday life, and we're going to look at the base structure, which feeds into this. And in this, we have capitalism. One of the defining characteristics of capitalism, as you'll see in page 28, is the profit motive. And whenever we look at a Marxist critique of the media, we're going to assume that in capitalism, the interest is capital, profit, making a profit. Let me give to you another. I'm attempting here to give you have the textbook definitions of things, and I'm trying to give you kind of like a beginner's understanding of how to understand these ideas in a very practical way. So many of you are youngsters, you know what I'm talking about, in your 20s, teens maybe, some of you. And some of you you love animals. You say, oh, I want to start an animal shelter. And this is very idealistic, and some older person in your life, maybe your parent or someone who's lived a bit longer than you have, says, veterinarian. I want to be a novelist. I want to write the great novel. The practical person who's 30s, 40s, 50s, you've heard the saying, don't trust anyone over 30. I believe that. And then as I got older, I said, don't trust anyone under 30, because our judgment is different. Our outlooks in life are different. They remain very, very different. And there's this, for example, I want to write the great novel. I want to be a novelist, Henry Miller and whomever, John Steinbeck. And then the person who's been around and has been hungry and has become tired, because as you get older, you lose energy, and hopes and dreams don't always line up like you, and don't ever line up the way you anticipate they're going to be surprised. They say, okay, how about journalist? How about English literature professor? You see, this is taking a kind of like idealistic, dreamy thing and turning it into something practical. Now let's take another. So I'm parsing out these ideas of a Marxist critique of capitalism. So in capitalism, the businessman says, journalist, English professor, writing how-to books that are going to sell. You write a book that the public is after at that given moment. If they're interested in, who knows what, if they're interested in Elon Musk, write a book about Elon Musk. Doesn't matter what your inside, what your heart wants or is interested in. You just do what is profit driven. And then you have this Marxist idea that there's something inside of you that needs to be fulfilled. And that if you start thinking as a profit motive alone, if you privilege the profit motive, that thing dies. I have been sneaking Marxist theory into you so far in this semester. When you come to college, you grow up in a capitalist culture, and you might be asking yourself the question, how is this going to serve me? How much money am I going to make when I get that diploma? So your idea is on profit motive. Is this class going to make me any money, right? One of the questions that the young artist in the capitalist culture always has to contend with is they get the impulse to write a story or to compose music. And then someone says, well, that's nice. You're devoting all this time to it. How's it going to make you any money? I often see in articles that come out the idea of the top colleges ranked. I just saw yesterday, top college for what? How much money you're going to make when you get out. It happens to be University of Pennsylvania. University of Pennsylvania has the best record of graduates making the most money. Now, this is very interesting. This is those of us who are artists or in the creativity game, which I spend a good portion of my life being a part of the creative endeavors, writing books and music. I love music. Music was my first profession and first schooling, education. And you can't ask yourself how much money this is going to make. You just have to remain true to the art and produce it and make it. And if in a certain system money is made from it, that's wonderful, but that's not the intention. So here's how I'm painting this picture for you. I post throughout the course, I post articles that I find interesting. I look through the morning newspapers that I read, and I say, oh, this is interesting. The students will dig this. And I place it onto the platform, the canvas, and I say, here's an opportunity for you to read and discuss. What's absent from this is what? It's not graded. What is a grade? A grade is a profit. Not with a PH, with an F. A profit. So in other words, this grade you get is like cultural commodity. It's if you at the end of the course, if you have an A, you're millionaire or maybe billionaire, and everybody wants the A, not the B, because the B's somewhere didn't work hard enough. Didn't you see this meritocracy, this idea that if I invest in something, I become wealthy, grade rich. So now you're faced with a very interesting situation. You take a class, assuming you're interested in media psychology. You take the class to want to enrich your knowledge, want to satisfy your curiosity, your craving to know more about this topic, to get turned on to new ideas, uncomfortable ideas, or maybe even to find that some of the ideas confirm what you suspected all along. However, those are all intrinsic motivations. In other words, you do it because you have curiosity. You notice in my letters to her, I say, enjoy your explorations. You see, this is an intrinsic satisfaction. You dig it, and that's why you do it. You dig? You dig it, and that's why you do it. An extrinsic motivation is the capitalist profit motive. You do it because you're going to get a grade for it. Now, we have a mixture here because I have to assign you a grade because I'm in a certain system. Here's a Marxist critique of the system. I'm in a system. I need to pay my bills. I need to pay for my education that I invested in, my groceries, my gas bill, my electricity, my internet, all these things, my home. And how do I do that? Well, I've entered into a system in which I agree to offer students intelligent ideas, teach them things I know about. And I read that, assumingly the students do not know, at least at the same level that I might know them, these ideas. And then the student demonstrates that they've grasped these terms. So there's the capitalist part of our course. Every, Sunday night before 6 p.m. when you invest your work in and then you get a return on your investment the following week when I grade it, that's capitalism. But every time one of you, and I take note of this, I notice this, every time one of you chooses to comment on an article that I found interesting to share with you, and the only motivation is an intrinsic motivation. There's no payoff, extrinsic payoff for this. The only is an intrinsic. It's saying, I want to get involved in this conversation. That is a return to what Marx was talking about in his 1844 philosophical manuscripts, economic and philosophical manuscripts. What this says is, think about this. Do you go to university? Do you come here to college? What's the reason? What's the reason? Well, in capitalist culture such as our own, you are hoping potentially to have a better economic life. College degree will mean that you'll have certain profession, certain income level, certain maybe cultural status. Status is a big one, getting those letters before or after your name has cultural commodity in our culture. It might not be money, but it's power. Marx talked about the bourgeoisie, who are the wealthy ruling class. That's like the administrators in a college. And then he talked about the proletariat, which is the working class folks. That would be the students. And then the petite bourgeoisie. We have people like professors and inventors and musicians and artists and authors. The petite bourgeoisie are the little bourgeoisie, like college professors. We don't have the economic money that the bourgeoisie have. We don't make anything close to what chancellor and president of the university make. However, we have something that's very valuable, cultural commodity. Every week, I got 50 of you hopefully tuning in that I can influence, and that can have implications on the university structure. That can have implications on who gets voted into office by expressing different ideas on many different things. So the petite bourgeoisie, we kind of like float in this world that we're part of. We make the money of the proletariat, the working class. But we have another kind of social power that's like the bourgeoisie, the superstructure. There's one other level of folks that Marx talks about, the lumpen proletariat. These would be people who just lump. They sit like a bump on a log. These are people who are like bottom feeders. In other words, they don't do anything. They just take money. They just collect money. So this would be someone who perhaps is perfectly capable of entering into some sort of work, but doesn't, and instead just collects money off of the government, this sort of thing. That would be the lumpen proletariat. So we have these 4 different classes of individuals. But I think I hope that I'm painting a picture here that clearly gives you the idea. So for real life, of how we can understand things in an interesting way through Marxism. I'm making this a lot to do with university right now. I remember the first time I started seeing something that all of you grew up with. Billboards for university programs. This never existed when I was growing up. You never drove down the highway and saw a billboard for this school's MBA program or this school's social work program or this school's whatever program. And now you can drive down New Jersey Turnpike or drive down Garden State Expressway or 278, wherever, and you will see billboards advertising universities. Some of them will even say, you can come to this school up in New York State, I forget which one it is, and pay less than your degree at Rutgers in this state, etc. Not only that, you see billboards promoting this insurance company covers the Rutgers, the official Rutgers football athletics insurance company. Wow, this is interesting stuff. So now you have, I remember seeing in Pennsylvania about 15 years ago, a billboard for a small local college, DeSales University. It's a private Catholic school. And this was the time when all of the local little schools were making MBA programs, because this was a big profit driver for universities. And the billboard was this couple, and it was a house with a white picket fence and a golden retriever and beautiful flowers in the flower bed and birds singing. Everything was beautiful. And it said, achieve your dreams with a DeSales MBA. And I looked at this, I said, oh boy, this is dangerous business. Why is this dangerous business? What's the ideology? The ideology that's inherent in our culture is that if you have a college degree, if you have a graduate degree, if you have a business degree, you will have success. You might not like business, you might not be interested in business, you might want to draw and paint, but if you do this, you will be successful. And I thought, I wonder if that school can live up to this promise, because what happens when everybody starts getting these MBAs and they become worthless because there's so many of them? See, once something is flooded in a market, in a capitalist system, it's the supply and demand chart. Once you have too much of something, it loses value in a capitalist system. Now, as Marx tells us, and as Erich Fromm teaches us as well, if you base your sense of self on what you have and you lose what you have, you've lost your sense of self. But if you base your sense of self instead on what you do, and I don't mean doing business, I mean what you do, something intrinsically motivated. And you do something because this is why you are here. It's your vital life source. This is what you do, like a craftsman who makes woodworking materials, or any type of artisan. It's very popular today for artisans, take out artisan lifestyle, or to be an artist. Or even if someone is in their heart of hearts passionate about business, you see that person, even if they lose all of their stuff, they still have an intrinsic, they're doing it from something, there's an intrinsic reward, just like writing these reactions to things that I'm sharing with you with no extrinsic reward. If you base your sense of self, Fromm tells us through Marx, if you base your sense of self on what you do, on an intrinsic reward system, rather than on what you're going to get, in other words, doing something as an ends in itself, not as a means to some other end. In other words, you do something because this is why you're here to do this. Well, then you always have a rich life that you're based on. Might not be super opulent, but that's not the point of the whole thing. As a parallel to our situation, it would be like taking a class because you're deeply interested in learning the materials, learning what this professor and these readings have to teach you, regardless of what the outcome of the class is. You're rich because you've read and you've absorbed it, and you're living in the moment. And you know what they say, time flies when you're having fun. But the idea here is that when you are in the moment, you forget about time. When you are in the stuff because you love reading it, and you would read it even if you weren't getting a grade for it or even getting paid for it. I'll share with you that I study these things. All this stuff we're working on, I designed this class out of the pure joy of I'm interested in it. It fascinates me. Some of the stuff I've gone over so many times that I know it, but I like getting turned on to new ideas. I'm always reading more and exploring more. It has nothing to do with getting rich. It has a little bit. It just I piggyback making a living on this, because that's necessity. You got to stop at the red light. You got to you have to survive. So to completely abandon any idea of practicality would be foolish. However, you're onto something if you'd be reading it and exploring it, even if it weren't your job. And I can sincerely tell you that over the past 20 years of my teaching, the vast majority of the things that I've shared with my students, courses I've taught, with a few exceptions, I would have enjoyed doing even if I wasn't getting paid, although I have to get paid. So you have to walk this tightrope in these ideas. But these are ideas of Marxist theory. So as you can see, I'm offering you a way to understand Marxist theory that isn't so out there. It's kind of, now I guess it could be considered out there if you are a hardcore kind of like realist business person. And some people obviously have life situations that they have to, they don't have luxuries of doing things only out of passion, etc. Understandable. However, if we look at a broad picture of things, we'll find that most people are living lives, at least at some point in the situation, where they're in the beginning or now they're deep into it. Some of you are like eating a porcupine, swallowing a porcupine. You might be so deep into your college education now that you can't stop, even though you don't enjoy it anymore. Because being so would be like trying to pull a porcupine back out of your throat. You have to swallow it, because of the quills will get, you just have to swallow it and digest and go through it. This happens with majors all the time. People graduate university with majors that they're completely not interested in, simply because they got into it so deeply that now they have to continue and finish it off, or it's a bigger loss. Okay, that is a basic idea of Marxist theory, how to utilize Marxist critique without being a Marxist. And of course, what we're talking about is ideology. You're watching the Slavoj Žižek film. Listen carefully because he has Slovenian accent and his English is kind of wonky sometimes. It's also very funny and interesting what he has to say in his illustrations, but he describes as putting on the glasses that reveal the ideology. So we're seeing the superstructure and we put the glasses on and suddenly we can see the base structure and suddenly we see the manipulation. So let's look at patterns of media ownership. Okay, so we have here concentration, conglomeration, integration, multinationalism. These are the patterns of media ownership. Now I'm going to give you, you have to read these and understand, and then if you go to the end of the chapter, and look at consequences of ownership and patterns of profit maximization. This is important. Few pages to read, 53, 54, 55, and 56, 57. Those are important because this first half of the chapter tells you what the things are. The second, those last 4 pages tell you why it's interesting to talk about these things. And so this is what I'm going to tell you about. I'm going to draw a very simple picture for you. Concentration, conglomeration, integration, and multinationalism. I'm going to give you one simple example that uh, will collapse all of these ideas and hopefully make them click for you. In America, in the United States of America, we go into the snack aisle and we look down the aisle and we say, my goodness, God bless America, look at all these potato chips. Any type of potato chip, which should I choose? And we're looking around so amazed, oh my goodness, what variety. And then maybe you travel somewhere else. Maybe you go, as I have, live in Peru for a while, or visit Haiti, or some other, China, etc. And you go down the aisle and you say, oh, they don't have the variety of potato chip selection that we have. What freedom we have. We have all these different varieties of potato chips. The Marxist says, yes, you walk down the aisle and you have to choose all in America, all these in a capitalist culture, you get to choose any type of potato chip you want. And what do you get at the end of the day? Potato chip. In other words, the choice is not really a choice. It's an illusion of a choice. Because actually, you get potato chip regardless. Now, this is an idea of understanding how patterns of ownership affect things. You go down the aisle, you say, oh my goodness, what selection? A car, potato chips, whatever, colleges, movies, whatever. And at the end of the day, your purchase is still going to the same place. In patterns of media ownership, and you're still getting the same thing. So you think you're getting something different. You can even do a political critique of this. Oh, I'm a liberal. Oh, I'm a conservative. And at the end of the day, you still vote something in that's an extremist. I like to always joke around about the ideology of belief systems. I see cars driving around. They used to have the Darwin fish. You don't see this much anymore, but someone on their bumpers has a Darwinism. And then you get someone else that has the Christian fish, creationism. And you see these two cars, you say, oh, these two people, they couldn't be more different. In fact, they're identical. They're exactly the same. Why? Because they're both choosing to express their ideology on a bumper. Not all of us do this. Not all of us decide to let everyone know on our bumper what we believe in. So in other words, what you're ending up with is the same person, different manifestation of the same thing. Like potato chips, whether it's barbecue or salt and vinegar or regular, you're still getting potato chips. When we get into ideas of concentration and integration and conglomeration, this is the idea that you have different styles of potato chips to select from, but the selection, no matter what you buy, the same company is owning all the potato chips, so they profit. So they're giving you choice, but their choice will always, it's a game where you get the choice between salt and vinegar and barbecue, but regardless of what you choose, they are still getting your money. That's the profit motive. Your money's going to the same company. And as we see more and more in media, this is the case. This is the case with media. So if you, it's very interesting. In mobile telephony, we have maybe some of you use consumer cellular. I remember I was using AT&T, and as you read from your textbook, AT&T is one of the big six major conglomerates of media, not just telephones, but all forms of media companies are owned by AT&T. So if you go to the movie, you purchase download a movie or something like this, the profit is going to AT&T. If that movie picture distributor and platform for viewing, and even if you're going to a theater, the theater could be owned by the AT&T parent company. So I got turned on to consumer cellular, and for my needs, I found that it was perfect. So I called and I said, how can you please tell me how is it possible that I've been paying AT&T nearly 3 times the fee per month for what you're offering me for a third of the cost. How is this even possible? And they said, because we rent the towers that AT&T owns. And AT&T is responsible for maintaining those towers, but we rent a certain amount of traffic from them, and then we sell those to our customers, but we're not responsible for the maintenance of those towers and everything. So at the end of the day, I am paying consumer cellular, but who's really getting the profit? AT&T. It's just another, there's someone taking, they're paying for AT&T's towers, so it's still AT&T in a certain sense. This is the way we can understand how these conglomerations. So the idea here, whether it's politics, whether it's movies or websites or whatever you're looking at, even YouTube, look into who owns YouTube. You are actually still, you might be choosing A over B, but the money's still actually, your money's still going to A. If we, let's see, how are we doing on time? Oh, we're almost up to an hour here. I hope you're finding this useful and interesting. Let's look at strategies for profit maximization. Synergy, planned obsolescence, logic of safety, and celebrity and spectacle, joint ventures, advertising. This chapter is just filled with good stuff. Well, let's look at, firstly, logic of safety. I can illustrate this for you in college textbooks. I have been looking at college textbooks for years. Now, when I went to school, I studied the New School for Social Research, and we didn't have textbooks. We studied primary source materials. So in other words, much like I do here, I'm giving you primary source materials to read. Now, the Otten Mac is an exception. This is a textbook. In other words, Otten Mac is a published textbook, and the textbook publishers are trying to get as many sales as possible. So this publisher, this is owned by Wiley, but it's a Blackwell. Blackwell is the imprint. Wiley's the the top owner of Blackwell. But Blackwell, so you have this textbook that's offered. Now they want as many people as possible that are studying critical media theory, whatever the class is. This could be a class in itself, media critical theory. I'm just making a part of media psychology. But they want to get as many professors as they can to use this textbook. Think of your Introduction to Psychology textbook. That Introduction to Psychology textbook needs to satisfy the position of many different psychologists. So your psychology professor could be cognitive psychologist, could be a therapist, could be a researcher, could be a behaviorist, behavior specialist, could be a humanist, could be a Buddhist psychologist, a psychodynamic psychologist. The logic of safety is that if that textbook kind of waters everything down and makes everybody happy and doesn't offend anyone, it gets the most sales. What do you get? A watered down textbook that plays it safe. That's the logic of safety. So the idea here is that if you look at textbooks from 30, 40 years ago, you'll see much more. And also if you look at texts that are written, primary source texts by authors, not by a group of authors, in a packaged textbook, you are going to find much more controversial statements, controversial ideas being presented. As soon as you have a logic of safety, that the safer something is, the more likely many people are going to purchase it. That's called logic of safety. So there is an implication of a capitalist profit motive affecting what's being talked about within a textbook. Planned obsolescence. Hopefully you all know what this is, planned obsolescence. Very brief idea is that some of you may have grandparents who have had a refrigerator for 30 or 40 years, and the refrigerator's still working. And when something goes out, the repairman comes in and fixes the refrigerator. And you might also realize that today a refrigerator has a lifespan of about 10 years. And usually it breaks, the repairman comes and tells you it'd be cheaper to just buy a new one. This is planned obsolescence. This is, let me give you an idea here. In other words, it's engineered obsolescence. Something is has an artificial lifespan built into it so that the demand in the supply-demand chain remains constant. So you'll have to buy a new refrigerator after 10 years. If you're lucky, you won't, but chances are you will, maybe even before then. Planned obsolescence is a way of dealing with, it's a way of manipulating the supply and demand relationship. Why? Because if demand goes up and supply goes down, then value goes up, and what you can charge for something goes up. So if you have a refrigerator that, let's use an example of Volvos. I've been a Volvo owner since I was 20 years old. So if you get a Volvo 240, so every Volvo I've owned has gone to, I drove 400,000 miles before I traded it in. It was still running, it was still fine. I should have kept it. The one that had the least amount of miles was 270,000 miles, and the transmission went on that, and it would have cost, I wasn't willing to have the transmission. That would have been a $4,000 job, and I just couldn't. I mean, some would argue that if I would have gotten the transmission replaced, I probably still had another 100,000 miles left on the engine or more. So even that, nevertheless, you get what I'm saying. The older Volvos, when they were owned by Volvo, a private company, this is before they were owned by Ford. 1999, Ford bought Volvo, and Ford engineers got their hands into Volvo. And then it was a few years later, around I forget the exact year, but that Ford sold the Volvo company to a Chinese conglomerate that owns it now, owns a lot of different car manufacturers. So now the engineers get their hands in things. A Volvo today might still go 200, 300,000 miles, but very seldom will you hear of a million-mile Volvo, which is where, when I was growing up, the old 240s, you could find 400, 500, 6,000, 100,000 miles on the original engine, and even 1,000,000 miles. And Volvo had this thing that if you took care of your car and it reached 1,000,000 miles, they gave you a free Volvo. This doesn't exist anymore. So now the new engineering, things like longevity and safety were the ideology. That's why people bought Volvos in my younger years. Now Volvo has become more luxury oriented. People are so it's a luxury and safety. People aren't they're leasing them. They're getting that they want the newest one. So planned obsolescence, engineered obsolescence, whether it's fashion or design. Volvo is another great example of this because the 240 series was the design of the car. It didn't change every year. It just remained that look. You have a first series 240 Volvo station wagon, then you have the second series, which is a little boxier in the 80s. And they discontinued in 92 the original, and then you had the third series, and then the fourth was newer. Now we're in like the fifth or the sixth series, but they usually last about 5 to 10 years of the identical aesthetics. So you can't tell if the car is a 2009 or a 2012. They look exactly the same. So planned obsolescence would be changing the style of the car each year so dramatically that you can see that it's the older car, which psychologically might make someone feel, oh, I need the newer car. Or having a part that's built to last only a certain amount of miles before it needs to be replaced for economic profit motives. So that's planned obsolescence. Okay, we are running into an hour here. I hope that I've given you enough to chew on remember to look at page 53 to 57 and really study that. Watch the videos. Don't, if you're confused with the Zizek, just soak it up and enjoy it and take from it what you can. But I want you to start thinking about, for the assignment, is to start to see how the things that you were told growing up, the ideology of your economic and political system, how that affects how you view things, and what happens if you step back and critique that system. Critique the idea. Just to wrap this up, politically. We're seeing now, the conversation is, the experiment of democracy is being tested in America. The experiment of democracy. Well, we can go back to Plato. And Plato tells us that democracy has a weakness. What is the weakness? Well, if you have majority rules, which is the basis of democracy, doesn't always mean that the mass is going to come up with the wisest or smartest decision. And this is a problem of democracy. Once you, as Plato said in his Republic, if you give that much power to the mass of people, and the majority of people aren't so smart or aren't so well thought out or aren't seeing through the manipulations of power, then the best candidate isn't selected. All this stuff applies to political Marxism as well. So you can treat political candidates like potato chips or movies or etc. Okay, everyone. I have enjoyed sharing these ideas with you, and I hope that they have opened you up to some new ways of thinking and seeing. Enjoy this reading and the videos that I posted.